On this week's episode of Scaffolds, I talked to Dr. Rebecca Schmidt-Jeffris about biological control in tree fruit. Kerik talks biopesticides and bacteriophages, and Anna gives us our state-of-the-state update on degree day accumulation and trap captures. Okay, so today I'm here with Rebecca Schmidt-Jeffris. She is a research entomologist in Wapato, Washington at the USDA facility there. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Monique. Glad to be on.
I also wanted to add that Rebecca is the editor-in-chief of American Entomologist, a magazine that mostly just entomologists read, but is a very cool thing to be doing.
Yeah, no, it's really fun, and it's really different to kind of have the fun version of science writing as part of my day-to-day.
Yeah, it's a totally different way of viewing, interacting with an audience for sure. But what I really wanted to talk to you about was biological control in tree fruit, something that you are absolutely one of our top experts in, and ask you about some of the work that you're doing. In particular, I'm interested in, you guys are doing drone releases of different types of predators. And what has been your experience with that? And what do you think the promise is for the use of biological control agents in this manner?
Yeah, so the predator we've done the most work with drones is a mealybug destroyer, which is a smaller kind of solid black with the orange head lady beetle. People don't realize right away that they're just another lady beetle because they don't have the characteristic red with black spots. So with those, drones do not appear to be very promising. And that's my caveat, really anytime I'm talking to folks about doing drone releases, is that most of our experience, the exception of one trial we've done this year, which I'll talk a little bit more about, has been with those mealybug destroyers. We've done a little bit with minute pirate bug, which is an Aureus species. And then we've done some work with lacewing eggs. So for those first two things, I think the reason we've seen results that don't make me super excited is those are both insects that fly in the life stage that you purchase them in. They are adults, they have wings. And so when you release something with wings above the tree canopy, its inclination is to fly and fly far, far, far away. Those are also just two organisms we haven't had a lot of luck with establishing in orchards post-release anyway. So it's a little hard to compare drone versus ground releases when you find like two individuals post-release in the ground treatment and 0 individuals post-release in the drone treatment. Does that really mean anything? Where we've done lacewing eggs, we've also not seen great results. I think that's the artifact of it's an egg that doesn't really stick to the leaf, and so it just sort of spills right off post-release. But I said we've got a caveat to that is we did do one trial this year where the first set of releases we did with the drone was lacewing eggs. We saw the first time where we didn't find any lacewing larvae post-release, and in that case it was in either treatment. I think the loose eggs and the drone eggs just don't seem to hang out in the tree canopy. They fall out. But when we tried it again, we did it comparing a drone release and a ground release with lacewing larvae, and there our recovery rates on the larvae were pretty equivalent in the drone and the ground. So at bare minimum for getting those larvae into the trees, the drones seem to have worked on that particular go.
So what were you targeting on the ground in terms of pests with all these different, they're such generalists, but I was wondering if there was anything in particular that you were looking for them to be active on.
Yeah, so with the mealybug destroyers, it's pretty clear because it's in the name. We're targeting mealybug. So we get both grape and apple mealybug in orchards out here in Washington and apples. There, the growers get really frustrated in organics in particular because conventional products don't even work very well. So you can get a sense of how well the organic products work for mealybug control. So you get a lot of fruit marking, especially because those mealybugs will jam themselves into the calyx and get some honeydew fruit streaking. For the Aureus, that was the original trials were us looking to see if they had any promise for controlling peristilla. They don't appear to, at least at the rates that we tested. The Aureus species that's commercially available is native to the east coast of the U.S., but has never been found on our neck of the woods. So I'm assuming it's not a happy climate match for them. So there's that added little caveat too. And then with the lacewings, most of our trials have been looking at aphid control, although we did do some in pairs to see if they could put a dent in peristilla. And the answer, once again, appears to be no.
So one interesting thing about Rebecca is that she was a postdoctoral researcher here at Agritech with Brian Nault. So she does happen to know a bit about the climate differences between where we are and the West Coast. So when it comes to biocontrol, I think on the East Coast, there might be this overall sense of a little bit of disinterest in it, where it seems like on the West Coast, and even when I was working in California, like there's an extreme interest in this. So could you talk about maybe why this is? Why is there such a negative outlook on the East Coast in terms of biocontrol?
Yeah, there's one big thing and one small thing, I think. So the big factor is humidity, humidity, humidity. So you did some work on vegetable entomology in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was the same thing where it was really hard to incorporate biocontrol into research, where you have biocontrol agents that are sensitive to at least one of the fungicides that absolutely has to be applied or the crop will die in the case of vegetables. So when you've got a spray program that requires a fungicide to go on minimum once a week in most cases, there's a lot less room for fungicide-sensitive natural enemies to establish. And then in the case of augmentation, if you've got to spray something after spending quite a bit of money on a natural enemy, that you wasted money kind of twice that way. So that makes augmentation in particular really difficult. And that kind of brings up the smaller reason, which is if you're trying to do an augmentation program on the East Coast, you're typically working with smaller acreage crops with a few exceptions. So you don't have a grower that's got, this massive level of acreage and this huge operation that might have some capital to throw around and investing in trying out and develop an augmentation program. Whereas, that's definitely true here in the West Coast, where we do have folks that have been kind of playing around with it for maybe a decade and have kind of narrowed into what works for them. But yeah, we're just so much drier. So the fungal pathogen pressure is a lot lower.
So definitely the diseases drive the program here, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts about tree fruit, in particular apple, on the East Coast and the use of biological control agents. There's a lot of talk about Aphelinus malli, which is the wasp that attacks woolly apple aphid, but there's no commercially available source. And I don't know if you guys have worked with that at all in Washington.
Yeah, so we do have a mallee out here in Washington too. It can be really, really abundant, especially in certain organic orchards where they've, gotten a nice cold. And you can go back to old shoots, I'm talking like 3-year-old wood. You're sampling for aphids for that season, but you're seeing just mummies from like the last 1 to 2 years just piled up on top of each other in some of these orchards. But yeah, we don't have a commercially available source out here either. And that's really been the challenge for us for augmentation. We have a lot of large scale organic orchards that are willing to pay the price point that these insectaries have for their beneficial organisms that they are rearing and selling, but a lot of what is commercially available is not suited to our climate, or it's just somebody wants an aphid parasitoid, but the aphid parasitoids that are on the market are for aphid pests that exist in greenhouses. There's nothing specific to apples that are available. I also get a lot of questions about, is a commercial insectary ever going to rear Trichonides insidiosus, which is the parasitoid for Paracelia? And my answer is no, probably never. One, it's very, very difficult to rear Paracelia in culture, just because they tend to take out the trees that you have them on before you get them all the way through. And it kind of tends to be smaller scale research stuff. But the big one is, in order to be willing to put in that investment into basically rearing a new organism, creating new stock, the insectaries would have to see that they've got a really good, base of who's going to be purchasing from them. And the pear acreage just doesn't justify it compared to what they get from all the greenhouses in North America, where they can be a little more generalized in what they rear, just focus on greenhouse pests.
Are there any other things your lab is working on in apple that you think might be worth discussing?
Yeah, so we, in addition to augmentation, and this is kind of just across the board, is we look at conservation. And conservation always plays in with augmentation. Like, it's no good releasing something if the environment you have isn't suitable for where you're putting it. You're throwing bad money after bad money. So what we have been primarily working on in that aspect is looking at at the integration of pesticides with augmented natural enemies, both in the context of conventional pesticides as well as starting to look a little bit more at organic pesticides, in particular at organic pesticide compatibility with lacewings. But really, really across the board, that's the big push that I get from growers, is looking at specific chemical combinations with natural enemies, especially as new chemicals get registered in tree fruits. Is, well, what about this one? Is this one compatible with the natural enemy that we typically release as part of our program?
And are you seeing that the newer compounds are having better compatibility, or do you think that that is not true?
It's really hit or miss. I think the newer compounds tend to always be better than the old stuff. So we're talking like, the most of the pyrethroids, of course, the organophosphates, the carbamates. Then within the newer materials, there's always going to be variation in whether or not something is broad spectrum or very selective. So there are new compounds for caterpillars. Those tend to be quite a bit more selective than newer compounds that hit piercing, sucking pests, just because to get that suite of pests, you're usually going for a broader spectrum compound.
Well, that's awesome. And thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. Yeah, it's been a blast working with these basically little tiny, wonderful little biocontrol agents. And we just hope to basically do the best for them when we put them out.
Okay, it's been a hot, dry week. Couple of tornadoes and not a lot of disease pressures yet, but I think we've got some rain coming next week, so I'll be able to talk a little bit more about observations. But because we're catching a little bit of a break on the disease front, I thought I would talk a little bit about biopesticides, in particular, the bacteriophage as a biopesticide. Now, what are biopesticides? Naturally occurring pesticidal substances. They can be plant extracts, minerals, microorganisms or their products, or there could be plant incorporated protectants. What a PIP is a transgene. And a lot of these things will vary in cost, type, efficacy, but the great news about them is they're really low risk for resistance development. EPA has a wonderful list of them, and there are other types of materials as well, such as the FDA is generally regarded as safe product, which are kind of food additives to a certain extent that have pesticidal properties as well. You can check out these different lists on the various web pages, and there are even EPA minimum risk pesticides that are typically under the PFRA 25B exempt inert ingredients, and they also have pesticidal substances. So how do these things work? There's a couple of different modes of actions for things that might be interesting in apple, such as fire blight, powdery mildew, fly speck sooty blotch, maybe even rust. So what do? There's a couple of different ways they work. They can make an antibiotic metabolite, the organism in the soup can, and we can use that natural soup with literally the antibiotic, but naturally derived, to kill things directly. The second one is they might compete by competitive inhibition. Now, a great example of this in the apple world is the product Blossom Protect. It gets down in the floral nectaries and on the stigmatic surface and says, no, thank you, fire blight. Also is a similar product and available for things like mummyberry as well. Another fantastic example of a fungus that infects a flower that can be blocked by competitive inhibition. And then the last group are defense inducers. But if we're going to talk about phage, we're going to kind of throw them into the sort of direct kill approach as well. Most of the biologicals are protectants. They're not going to be a long-lived protectant, or they're an eradicant. They're going to just be there for a very brief time to protect or kill quickly the pathogens that are already there. That's where they're going to work. If the fire blight is multiplying on the stigmatic surface of an apple, we're going to kill it. Agrophage falls into this group, I would say, along with many of the other really common bacterial microbial soup products that are induced to make a naturally occurring antibiotic, like the double nickels, the serenades, the Serafel, and even to a little bit of a extent, we'll call this protectant, the Blossom Protect, so that competitive inhibition protector. And it might do some other things as well, as the literature shows, and all the various essential oils and even other things like polyoxin D. Now, we're not really going to talk about defense inducers, but I really want to focus on bacteriophage. Yeah, it's a really strange looking virus that specifically goes after bacteria. You might think of it as looking like a lunar moon lander. if you will. If you're trying to imagine these things in your eye, it's going to have a 20-sided Dungeons and Dragons looking dice on a little short tube with a bunch of little appendages that really help it attach, and the DNA or RNA in that head or will move through the tail and be injected into a bacterium. Quite a fascinating subject. There are all kinds of really interesting cartoons and videos on this stuff as well. They can be effective on bacterial diseases. In our scaffolds world of tree fruit, it would be things like cherries and fire blight of apple. Now, some of the real challenges with this product, I've used it and several of my other colleagues as well. And we've probably most frequently used the Agrophage product by Omnilytics that sometimes is marketed through or distributed by Certus as well. I've had the best experiences with this very heavily optimized and completely registered product as well. It is also on tomatoes and peppers, but there are apple labels as well. Now, it can be challenging to optimize. There's a lot of interest and there's a lot of effort going in to make this work because of its low environmental impact. At some level, if you want to keep the virus alive, you kind of have to feed it bacteria as you're waiting for your bacteria target to show up. And also, like the recent pandemic, when you decided to leave your groceries out of the room or let them sit out in the air or packages for a couple of days, air drying and sitting in the sunlight can break down viruses. It's wonderful protecting us from the pandemic. But if we want our bacteriophages to kill fire blight on the apple trees, we don't want them to dry out and get broken down in the sunlight. So those are some of the challenges. Now, I've done some trial work on this as well, particularly focused on a blossom blight. And in my trials, all things like antibiotics and biopesticides like bacteriophage or agrophage, I would put them on around 80% bloom, and then I would inoculate. And then in sometimes afterwards, again, I would apply them again. And depending on the protocol at the time by Omnilytics Certus, I might have a couple of applications of these phages in there. The idea being is they want to get that bacteria on the stigmatic surface or that may have already drained its way into the extrafloral nectaries and literally inject his DNA and pop it in a sort of a lytic cycle for those that are interested in sort of classic high school biology. I would come in after the initial protective phage thing at a really nicely timed application, but with a ton of bacteria. 10 to the 6 bacteria is a lot, and it's much higher than you might find in a commercial setting. And depending on the protocol, I might go after it again at 100% bloom after that. Protect it, the inoculate, and then hit it again with a little bit of post-infection activity. Like I mentioned before, you don't have to worry about resistance with these things. And then I would measure the incidence, how many flowers on the entire tree are blighted. Now, in this particular instance, you want to target bacteria on the surface. That virus needs to get there and kill the bacterium. If the bacterium is deep inside your apple tree in the form of shoot blight, applying it on the surface is not that useful. However, a lot of the shoot blight develops from my trials occurs from the inoculum left over from blossom blight. So if my bacteriophage, agrophage managed to manage a lot of the blossom blight, we would get less shoot blight in turn. And in this case, I'll look at the percentage of blighted shoots on the tree. So I looked at this over many years early on, and as I got to work with the product later and later, in the late 2020s, I guess we might call it. Now, I've noticed that the formulation and the materials I'm beginning are much more easy to use, easier to put out, much more well-packaged, and seem to have a pretty good shelf life. So in the early stages, then you had some food I had to feed it. Now, these products are seemingly better optimized every year. Now, all that being said, I had a pretty rough year in 2021 when I went out with some of these products. And for the blossom blight, I had an excellent control with things like firewall, and I had a lot of variability. And this is one of the earlier years I used it on blossom blight. And my variability could have been some reps might had 5% fire blight, others had 45, with about the average of around 25. But in that year, complete control with strep. However, even though it may have been a little bit more variable and not as effective as streptomycin per se in that particularly moderate pressure year, all of that inoculum reduction in the blossom blight led to a pretty decent level of shoot blight. Would you say that agrophage is not as good as other biologicals? Absolutely not. It can perform just as well as some of the other products going in at that time as well. So it's a viable tool. And also note that when I put this thing out, it's all by its lonesome. It's not in an integrated program. Now, 2022 was an even worse year. Hot, wet season, right at paddle fall, right around the thinning time. Nearly all of my orchards died whatsoever. In that case, even strep struggled to provide control of blossom blight, giving us about 25%, with nearly the entire tree dead. And with that, even in those tough scenarios, I didn't get the variability out of agrophage. I got about 50% control, which is on par or better than many of the other types of biologicals out there. Pretty decent control. I also looked at blossom counts. I didn't get a big impact of blossom counts on almost any product that year, mostly only strep and a couple other weird things like alum and ferry oxidate, which is a concentrated peroxide type product. So that was an interesting thing. But the shoot blight was still impacted by that bit of control that we got. In that essence, overall, when we got to the shoot blight, it really was not a lot of difference between even strep and agrophage because the season was too tough. But there was decent control, approaching about 40. That was a tough year. Now it comes along 2023. We finally have a cold season, decent pressure, still a lot of blossom blight in my trees, about 50% of everything blighted, enough to, cause considerable concern, have an orchard pushed up in a commercial sense. Excellent control of blossom blight with things like streptomycin. The other various biologicals in my trial were fairly variable, but a really great year from this agrophage product. A lot of variability, but that variability is complete control ranging up to 20% in that particular instance. And because of that level of inoculum reduction, we're able to get combined with that cooler season product. And potentially, I've noticed that the materials come nicer and nicer formulated and better and easier to use with fewer applications and whatnot required. Got a 100% control that year in on blossom population. So yes, everything was perfect for the product. I mean, no different than it would have been for strep. Applied it sort of the same timing, completely killed all my bacteria. Pretty nice little situation. Shoot blight was excellent as well, with a very low level. We had a lot of products that were fairly successful in that season, but overall, we found that the phage was one of the more successful ones. We even had phage in a different block as well. And in this other particular block of trees, it performed quite identically to it and I was also impressed at the short and more consistent error bars. And in my second block of trial, we still had a lot of shoot blight, even though it was cold. I mean, blossom blight was cold season, about 70%. With phage and things like strep and a couple of the other biologicals really getting under that 10% bar, which is good for a heavily inoculated trial. Shoot blight was also very consistently controlled, really short bars. And so what might we take away from thinking about this strange virus that bursts bacteria in the field? I've only used the agrophage product. I find that it's one of the better optimized ones for field use. I recommend using it on blossom blight. When that bacteria is out there, the phage needs to infect it. It's a virus, and it's going to inject its DNA and cause that bacteria to pop. It's going to do the lytic cycle, and this is going to reduce your inoculum and then in turn reduce your shoot blight. Once the bacterium's inside the tree, it's your virus is going to have a hard time getting there. Don't think of them as having the same circulatory system that we have, or if we get a virus, it goes all through our bodies. It's not going to move that quickly in our trees necessarily. If I was going to do this, I would go towards the evening. We mentioned with some of the antibiotics break down in UV light, but to avoid that photo degradation, maybe go towards the evening hours for your evening spray, if you will. And also populations of the fire blight bacterium can sort of surge as things go into the evening hours and humidity it sort of goes up as well as the heat still takes a little bit of time to cool off. One option for really improving these that we haven't done a lot of work with, but many of my colleagues have, are the various sunscreen type adjuvants as well, and using these. But we don't want to make the cost of the product go so high that it's cost prohibitive for the level of control you get. I think this would be a fantastic material and integrated program, perhaps with some competitive inhibition. And also during the cooler periods, if you have a bloom period coming up and you're on the fence with the level of fire blight risk predicted and it's a low or high as opposed to extreme and infection, then this might be a good opportunity for you to test out your bacteriophage. There is a little bit of variability within plots, but that seems to be the case with all biopesticides. This is not something particular to this one. As we get better using them, better formulating them, and more experience using them, I think the variability seems to drop. I've noticed that over the years, my error bars between my plots are getting better and more consistent as well. Also, what's really exciting about the phage is that the low environmental impact. There's a lot of community interest because of this low environmental impact to make these things work well in crops like apples. All right. That's all for this week. With the rain next week, I hope I won't be talking about disease concerns, but you never know. I'll be out in the orchards looking around and seeing how the summer diseases are progressing.
And now for the State of the State, your weekly roundup of phenology and degree day accumulations from major fruit production regions across the state. As always, I'm Anna Wallace with the New York State IPM program, and I'll be sharing information aggregated from the regional specialists, as well as my own observations. As was forecasted, it continued to be extremely hot in most places across the state and very humid, with highs in the upper 80s to 90s and overnight lows remaining in the 60s to upper 70s in most places across the state. Heat advisories continue to be issued in the Hudson Valley and in other locations, with a real feel of up to 100 degrees in some places. So just another reminder to stay hydrated, replenish electrolytes, and be looking out for each other in these heat waves. We've continued to see sporadic rainfall across the state again this week, with more dramatic differences this week. In some places, less than a tenth of precipitation was recorded over the past week, and in other locations, more than 3 inches. Most of the storms that brought some of the precipitation occurred in the middle of last week around Wednesday. Also some rain on Sunday evening, and then we had some more rain Monday evening in some parts of the Hudson Valley and other parts of the state that are not reflected in the weekly rainfall that's reported in the show notes. The U.S. Drought Monitor, which is a tool that you can access online that we've linked in the show notes, again shows that there are some spots in the Northeast that remain on the dry side with the category abnormally dry. You can see that on the map online in yellow. But most places across the state are not at risk. Most of the abnormally dry locations are across Wayne County, most of the county, as well as a few isolated locations in counties in the Hudson Valley, spots in Columbia, Greene, and Orange County. So it's just a good reminder to be looking at it for irrigation, especially for trees as fruit starts to ripen and continues to size, and for young trees. Looking at the forecast for the rest of the week and into next week, forecasted weather early in this week continues to be excessively hot, with a break in the weather toward the end of the week. The 6 to 10 day forecast, looking at the NOAA Climate Prediction Center, is forecasting above average temperatures to normal temperatures with normal precipitation amounts. And then the 8 to 14 day outlook from the NOAA Climate Prediction Center forecasts a return to hotter than average weather and wetter than average weather. And that outlook continues in the long-term forecast for the rest of the season for hotter and wetter than average for the months of July, August, and September. Phenology across the state now, as we've said for the past couple of weeks, we're closer and closer to terminal bud set on apples, and fruit continues to size and color really well. People are getting cover sprays on in between the rain and wind events. It continues to be a fairly compressed phenology across the state, with the early sites in the lower Hudson Valley maybe a week ahead of some of the later sites like in the Champlain Valley. Phenology and pest events seem to be fairly similar between the capital region and Geneva, and some of the lake sites in western New York are fairly similar to some of the Champlain Valley sites. In the Hudson Valley now, most apples are at terminal bud set, although with all of the rain in the past couple of weeks, in isolated locations, we are still seeing some new growth on some varieties. Fruit is continuing to color and size really well. Cover sprays are being applied in between rain and wind events. With the early season and the excessive heat, we are anticipating an earlier harvest than average. So at this time, make sure to be paying attention to your PHIs, your pre-harvest intervals, and making sure that you're applying materials according to those labels. Most sweet and tart cherry harvests are completed at this time in the Hudson Valley and wrapping up in other parts of the state. Plums, peaches, and nectarines are all in harvest now, especially the early varieties. And berries, including blueberries, raspberries, and other berries, are ripening quickly in the hot weather and still harvesting now. Looking at some current and upcoming pest events, apple maggot is probably the pest that is most on people's mind at this point in the season. We are continuing to catch apple maggot on traps across the state in monitoring locations. In many locations, we are only catching 1 or 2 per baited trap, which is not quite at threshold, while in other places we are well over threshold in known problem areas. And this is consistent with what we know about this pest. It can be very sporadic and site dependent. So just a reminder that we monitor for this pest earlier in the season with yellow sticky cards for the adult emergence. And then more commonly or later in the season, around the beginning of July, we begin been looking at red sphere traps coated with tanglefoot, and that's looking for those ovipositing females as they're getting ready to lay eggs in the fruit. So if you're using a baited trap with either ammonium acetate or some kind of pear or apple essence, the baited traps, the threshold is 5 flies per trap. And if you're using an unbaited trap, it's 1 or 2 flies per trap. Codling moth is another insect that we're paying close attention to now in the season. We're ending or tapering for the second generation of the moth flights. And in the Hudson Valley, we're beginning the hatch of second generation eggs. So that is predicted at 200 to 250 degree days base 50 after your second generation biofix, or the first moths in this generation that would be caught in traps. You can also estimate that timing based on the first generation biofix, and so that would typically be around 1200 to 1250 degree days base 50 after the first generation biofix or the first generation first moths. So that application timing is beginning now in the Hudson Valley and will happen pretty soon afterward in other parts of the state. Remember that if you had excellent control of the first generation of codling moth in your orchard, you're likely to have lower pressure in the second generation. But if you're surrounded or nearby any abandoned orchard or unmanaged wild hosts, you are likely to have insects moving in from the outside. So it's important to be staying covered during the second generation. Especially important for codling moth management is to be rotating chemistries. This insect can be endemic in the orchard if any survive, and so making sure to rotate chemistries so that insects don't develop resistance to the tools that we have available. Oblique-banded leaf rollers, the trap captures are tapering at this time across the state with very low trap captures in most locations. The insects are getting quite large at this time, so it's too late to be applying an insecticide targeting larvae of this insect. We are also continuing to see European red mites and two-spotted spider mites in some locations. We can expect more activity and faster generations with the really hot weather that we've been having, particularly in dry, dusty situations. Woolly apple aphid is very active at this time. In the past couple of weeks, we've seen colonies increasing and moving quite aggressively toward the leaf axils in a lot of places where we're scouting. We continue to also see Japanese beetle activity, brown marmorated stink bugs, second generation nymphs active now, and apple leaf curling midge in a few locations in different parts of the state where we know that there are problem areas. Leafhoppers are also present in some locations where they're not being managed. Looking at diseases, fire blight continues to be relatively tame across the state from the reports that we are getting. There are some known problem areas in New York where it has been a severe problem in the past, and we have reports from outside of New York State where fire blight has been a really severe problem. So fingers crossed that we continue to have that disease under management this year. Scab lesions continue to be reported in sort of unexpected places this year, so keep looking out for infections so that you can be managing secondary as necessary. Powdery mildew continues to be fairly severe in some places, again related to the really hot, humid weather that we've been experiencing. Other summer diseases are becoming more prevalent at this time. A little bit of sooty blotch and fly speck showing up, as well as some fruit rots are definitely present in some areas. And we're starting to see more of the yellow leaf spotting symptoms from Marsanina, glomerella, and necrotic leaf blotch at this time. This is normally when we would expect more of this to be showing up, and they can be a little bit tricky to differentiate. So if you want help with identification or diagnosis, please send your photos to your regional ag specialist or fruit specialist so that we can help you with diagnosing those disorders and diseases. A quick reminder that we've had 2 virtual orchard scout trainings this year. The first was pre-bloom and the second was post-bloom. And recordings for both of those trainings are now available on the New York State Integrated Pest Management YouTube site. So if you're interested in viewing those, we're including the links to those videos in the show notes. Janet Van Zorn, Mike Bastow, and myself provided detailed instructions on monitoring and scouting and identification for significant orchard pests. And so that included things like mite sampling, internal LEPs, identification and thresholds, a review of plum curculio injury and management, woolly apple aphid, apple maggot, apple leaf curling midge, stink bugs, and spotted winged Drosophila, among other pests. And now here are the current degree days in the major fruit-producing regions of the state. Throughout the season, we've been aligning this information with previous work done by Art and Yellow related to McIntosh phenology and degree days base 43. So now, from January 1st through July 15th, the current degree day accumulation base 43 is in Geneva, 2,239, in Highland at the Hudson Valley Research Lab, 2,413, In Clifton Park, 2,260. In Peru, 1,961. In Medina, an inland site, 2,167. Appleton North, a lake site, 2,016. Fairville, an inland site, 2,122. And Williamson, a lake site, 2,141. Again, those tables of the degree day accumulation and upcoming pest events are included in the show notes. That's all for this week, and good luck until next week.